Ani Bujukwe Skanakawaga Tonshi. Hello and welcome, everyone. We would like to start our session today by taking time to acknowledge and to honor the land that we live on and our relationship to Indigenous peoples. We do this because we desire to share a place that is just and equitable, and because we recognize and respect Indigenous peoples' prior and continued claims to the land and our shared responsibility for caring for the land, the water, and our relationships. This land is the traditional territories of the Huron-Wendat, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and most recently, the Massasaugas of the Credit River First Nations. Ontario is covered by 46 treaties and other agreements and is home to many Indigenous nations from across Turtle Island, including the Inuit and the Métis. These treaties and other agreements, including the One Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, are agreements to peacefully share and care for the land and its resources. Other Indigenous nations, Europeans, and newcomers were invited into this covenant in the spirit of respect, peace, and friendship. We are all treaty people. Many of us have come here as immigrants, newcomers in this generation or generations past, and we have benefited and built wealth from the land that Indigenous people shared. We are mindful of broken covenants and their impact on the health and well-being of Indigenous peoples, and we strive to make this right with the land and with each other. As the president of the Georgian Bay Association, it gives me great pleasure to welcome each of you here today to the first of our 3 extreme water levels, impacts, and strategies webinars. These webinars are jointly sponsored by the Georgian Bay Association and Georgian Bay Forever, and are in collaboration with our partners, the International Joint Commission, Severn Sound Environmental Association, and Council of the Great Lakes Region. Last year's H2O level symposium focused on how to manage the high water levels across the Great Lakes and Georgian Bay. Today's event and the 2 that follow are meant to give everyone a better idea on how we can adapt to current water levels, future water level forecasts, and the potential climate change impacts on Georgian Bay and your cottages. A few housekeeping items before we get started. A recording of this presentation and a written synopsis report will be available after the session. Please type in your questions into the Q&A box so that we can record them. If we are not able to answer all questions in the session, we will answer the questions in following a follow-up report. We will not be addressing basic water level questions in this symposium. Please refer to our respective GBA and GBF websites for the 2020 Q&A and symposium summary, where those questions are addressed by the expert panelists. All housekeeping information will be located in the chat box for your reference throughout this session. Before we kick off today's webinar, I'd like to introduce you to Marilyn Capriol, who will conduct today's opening ceremony. Marilyn is an Anishinaabe elder with Shawiniga First Nation and is a founding member of the Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership Elders Lodge. She has long been an advocate on Georgian Bay water issues and a long-time volunteer on many other worthy causes. She's also involved with the Georgian Bay Biosphere and is a member of the Indigenous Circle for the Canadian Biosphere Reserves Association. Welcome, Marilyn, and thank you for being here with us today. Miigwech.
Oh, when it was all, the beach quaid, no cosmic quado down. Huron Robinson Treaty, Gaba Young. My name is simply Water. I sit in the lodge of the Bear Clan, and we are all under the Huron Robinson Treaty in this territory. I was born and raised on these waters, and when I call this Gabayong, it means the Point Barrel Harbor, the area of where we access the water from the lands. And along the shores as it flows. And today, just recently, we have celebrated many great things, the calendar of time. First, I'd like to acknowledge the moon woman. And in the English, what it means is the falling leaves time, translate to what is going on with the earth. And it is our stand tall ladies that show those beautiful colors and appreciation for the life that they've had during this season, being fed with the water and the sky world, the birds, and the many songs. In relation to that, I'd like to introduce what I've known for a long time as the dance of the water lily and her importance. In those warm skies with Mishomis geezes, bringing things, calling things, inviting life to come back to its existence in the early springs. The pond people are very much our teachers on the water and how the conditions are going to be along with the water animals. But there's one special lady that comes. First comes her partner, the lily pad. And the lily pad, as we know it as children, explain why the little frogs are chamakis and have that as their home. We also understand that the lily pad was to collect the little fairies that fell from the sky, from the stardust. And in relation to that, as those warm summer suns begin to encourage the water life in that pond, brings the very tip of the nose of the water lily as she makes her way through each day, bringing her closer to the surface. When she gets here, she has an umbrella, a white coat that surrounds her. And as she peels back that coat every morning, we see the base of her children inside the yellow, indicating and reminding us of that eastern door where new life begins every day. As she flows through the waters, her umbilical cord is stationary and so connected to Earth Woman that she never forgets that responsibility. She governs the water. She is a strong medicine for those that need her, either the two-leggeds or the four-leggeds and the water swimmers. She will gently allow one to harvest as they need. That grandmother, as she grows older, cherishes so much that life that's around her. She allows the small minnows, the crawlers that live under the water, to come and tickle her. And she sings to them too as well. If there is a hint of hard weather coming in, her body senses that because she is so closely related to those water responsibilities. And soon you see her white coat folding up to protect the children, the future, the going forward. So inviting that dance of the water lily woman, we have a grand circle that we are sitting in and sharing with each other today. This year, she stayed strong for some reason, and she just went to sleep 2 days ago on Thursday. Friday came the first hint of the frozen snow, the frozen wind crystals. So we know that it is time for us to transition with her. So with this, I encourage us to have a good day and remember that there is so much love for us each and every day. And this is one of those special sacred days to join together. Miigwech. Oh.
Thank you, Marilyn, for that lovely introduction to this webinar series. For Georgian Bay Association, this webinar series is an opportunity to provide useful and practical information for our members on what is coming at us on future water levels, what is new since our joint symposium last year with Georgian Bay Forever, what the expected impacts of both extreme and high and low water levels will be, and what members can do, i.e. what strategies exist to adapt their properties. In this first webinar, we're going to focus on what is happening, what is new, and the actual impacts on wetlands, flora, and fauna. To kick things off, we are honored to have with us today Jane Corwin and Pierre, Béland, respectively the US and Canadian chairs of the International Joint Commission. Dr. Pierre Béland's many accomplishments include a distinguished academic career followed by significant scientific accomplishments in environmental biology and toxicology, during which Pierre published 3 books, numerous scientific and popular articles, hosted a TV series on the environment, and participated in several documentary films. He also owned and managed an aquatic and marine ecosystems equipment company, and his numerous appointments, including Commissioner for the Quebec Environmental Assessment Board, head of the Fisheries Ecology Research Centre, chairing public hearings for Parks Canada, Fisheries and Oceans Canada, Quebec Energy Efficiency Agency, and TELUS, senior posts at Department of Fisheries and Oceans Canada and the National Museum of Nature, and director of Aquaforum, which addresses water technology and the blue economy. Pierre first became an IJC commissioner as acting chair in 1995 to 1998, and was appointed again as the current Canadian chair in 2019. Jane Corwin has had an exemplary career as a member of the New York State Assembly from 2009 through 2016, where she was the minority leader, pro tempore, the ranking member of the Corporations, Authorities and Commissions Committee, and a member of the Environmental Conservation, Education, and also the Mental Health Committees. She was also president of the Philip M. and Jane Lewis Corwin Foundation since 2005, and is a director of Gibraltar Industries out of Buffalo, and was director of that from 2014 to 2018. In 2019, Jane succeeded former US IJC chair, Lana Pollock. So without more ado, I will hand it over to Pierre to start off the IJC presentations.
Thank you, Rupert. I have the honor of providing opening remarks for the second year in a row. And this time I will be with my colleague, Jane Corwin. We are both honored to have been invited to participate in this webinar series. I hope you hear me all right. Is the volume high enough?
Excellent.
Good. So these webinars are a good opportunity to share knowledge and expertise and create a common understanding of the ups and downs of Great Lakes water levels and their impacts, of course. It informs and supports resiliency means to protect against what are increasingly unpredictable effects of climate change. Next slide, please. Yeah, next one again. Yeah, that's me. That's okay. And I'm not going to cover this one because Jane will be talking about this. So let's move on to the next slide. And oh, one more. Yes, this one. This one. This is my main message to you today. So now, and I'll try and be brief, but be clear about what you're seeing there. This slide is not about levels. It's not about rain. It's not about any specific measurement. It's about, I'd say, nature in the eyes of a scientist. It's about an index for the entire Great Lakes Basin. That index combines weather, supply, temperature, information to understand how the lakes are behaving, the whole basin is behaving, and to understand how flood and drought events are related to what's happening in nature, in the atmosphere. The graphic shows, this part of the graphic shows the value of the index for each month from January 2017 to very recently, August 2021. Each bar is 1 month during that period. You see there is a horizontal line at 0. That line, just below the middle of the graph, is the average of that index for the years 1901 to 2000. So 100 years of data. So we take this as the starting point, as the average, as the 0. You will see that bars that are above are higher than 0, so they represent wet years or wet months in this case. Yellow bars represent drought months. It's easy to see that from January 2017, a fateful date for people on Lake Ontario when Plan 2014 started, you will see that these were wet months and increasingly wet. And into 2019, which was even wetter than 2017. So these two humps represent or correspond to the flooding events we've had in 2017 and in 2019. So the index combining all elements of the weather, if you want, correspond to flooding. You'll notice that 2018 was a bit lower, and there were the flooding just abated in many parts of the basin. 2019 was the wettest period, and even into 2020. But if you look at sometime in the middle, the basin started to get drier and drier and drier and moving towards 0. And then early in 2021, late February, March, April, May, June, we have yellow bars there. This means that the index is below 0. We were in a drought period. And then the basin became wetter. So this drier part explains why the lakes went down from the maximums that were reached by all lakes between 2019 and 2020. And even into 2021 in some cases. So there is a very good relationship between this index and what we are experiencing on the lakes. And this actually shows, again, as experts have been saying for a long time, that it is a natural weather regime over the lakes basin that drives whether we get floods or droughts, high levels or low levels. And we all recognize that climate change will continue to bring that sort of thing, additional uncertainty. And the high waters may even get higher and the low waters may get lower. It's very important to be aware of that and avoid complacency and use all available information to focus how we can best become resilient. I'm going to finish with telling you that Environment and Climate Change Canada has been working on the water levels projection study, and they expect to release the results of that study next year, early next year in the spring. So I encourage you all to be on the lookout for the release of that study. Now, I will stay here for the whole webinar, and I look forward to hearing the upcoming discussions and wish you a successful webinar. And I would like to introduce my dear colleague, Jane Corwin.
Thank you so much, Pierre. I appreciate that. And thank you to Georgian Bay Forever and Georgian Bay Association for inviting me to be a part of the webinar series this year. I'm very happy to be here. You know, Pierre and I have worked together since 2019, and during that time, we've seen our share of changes in water levels. We've learned a lot about the real effects of extreme water levels, about how people's lives and property can change dramatically. The events of the past few years have been a constant reminder for us about the importance of the wide-ranging responsibilities of the IJC. We've also learned the hard lesson that water regulation plans are no match for Mother Nature, and that the principles of adaptive management are our best single hope for dealing with changing climate and remaining resilient. Next slide, please. The IJC has an ongoing role to regulate Lake Superior outflows through the St. Mary's River and into Lake Michigan, Huron, and Georgian Bay. These outflows are regulated according to Plan 2012. The IJC board responsible for implementing Lake Superior's regulation plan is the International Lake Superior Board of Control. While Plan 2012 sets outflows to bring the levels of Lake Superior and Michigan Huron into closer balance, the variability in natural water supplies to the lakes has a much larger influence than outflows, and water supply is the dominant factor determining lake levels, including those of Georgian Bay. In other words, Lake Superior outflows can only have very limited effect on Lakes Michigan, Huron, and Georgian Bay water levels. Next slide, please. It is important to understand that future water levels are determined by the weather and not by the IJC's outflow regulation. As a result of the drier than average weather, water levels on Lake Superior have fallen below the seasonal long-term average for the first time since April 2014. This graphic shows the observed monthly mean water level at Lake Superior from January 2020 to September of this year, as well as the projected range of water levels forecasted, seen in the red shaded area to the right, from now until March 2022. Fortunately, the water levels have receded from their recent record highs. Lake Superior is now actually 1 centimeter lower than seasonal long-term average level for this time of year. The red dotted line shows the expected water level should average conditions occur. Note how the red shaded area widens as we try to predict water levels further and further into the future. It's that proverbial cone of uncertainty. This is due to the increasing unpredictability of the weather. Natural factors such as precipitation, evaporation, and wind are the main factors that affect water levels. Next slide, please. The next graphic shows the expected monthly mean water level of Lake Michigan, Huron, and Georgian Bay over the next 6 months. Lake Michigan, Huron water levels have declined significantly from the record high levels observed in recent years, but water levels remain above the seasonal long-term average. Many ask why Lake Michigan, Huron, and Georgian Bay water levels remain high while Lake Superior has returned to near average. As mentioned by Pierre earlier, the Lake Superior Basin has seen drier conditions over the past year than that of the Michigan Huron Basin. Next slide, please. Lake Superior outflow regulation is no panacea for preventing extreme levels on the upper Great Lakes. While it's been shown that compared to the previous regulation plan, Lake Superior Plan 2012 has moderated the highest levels of Lakes Michigan, Huron by a few centimeters in 2020, it could not prevent record high levels. Nonetheless, it is our hope that organizations and communities continue to communicate and work with the board and the IJC in cases where even small improvements can potentially be made. In past IJC studies, the IJC concluded that flow regulation is not an effective means of reducing the impacts caused by fluctuating water levels. Instead, the IJC has recommended to governments that they aggressively promote land use management as the principal component of a strategy to reduce the impacts of fluctuating water levels. This ability to use the principles of adaptive management is really the best way to prepare for changes in climate and the water level challenges that inevitably result. In the end, adaptive management brings resilience. Next slide, please. Again, thank you very much for the opportunity to attend today. The IJC looks forward to continuing our strong partnership with GBF and GBA, and with the many diverse groups that inform our work. We have an interesting program ahead of us today and look forward to hearing from others on the topics of Great Lakes water levels and resiliency methods. And we will be here for questions. Thank you.
think David's up next, actually. There we go.
Thanks, Rupert. And thanks to Pierre and Jane. And I think they framed the objectives very well. One of the things that we as Georgian Bay Forever want to make sure that we're talking about is the real issues and challenges, because those give us enough challenge to deal with going forward. And so our efforts here are to try to provide some great information around today, what's currently going to happen. And then, as Rupert mentioned in our next two webinars as part of this series, specific issues around how we can address, our coastlines, our properties, what the impacts on insurance are going to be, and things like that from these future potential changes that we're going to see. So it's really important to start the conversation today and to try to lay out what's coming as far as climate change impacts go. So Rupert, over to you.
Okay.
Oh, I should say too, sorry, Rupert, from time to time, we are going to put a poll up on the screen, and we'd ask attendees if you could answer the poll questions, and that would be great. Thank you.
Okay. So next slide, please. I think, David, weren't you going to do this slide?
I certainly could, Rupert. Yeah.
Thank you.
So I think part of what was mentioned today was by Jane just now, this cone of uncertainty when it comes to projecting the weather. That gets even harder when we start to look at what's going to happen to the climate being kind of the 30-year or 40-year timelines. So in order to do that, we have to use modeling. And as Pierre mentioned, Environment Canada will be coming out with a report in early 2022, updating their climate projections. But this was some information that was shared with us at our H2O 2020 event. And also we'll speak about some previews that we saw at the GLEC meetings, the Great Lakes Executive Committee meetings in June of 2021. So the precipitation and evaporation are predominantly the drivers of water levels, and the balance between those two processes are really what dictate what the actual lake levels are going to end up being. And as Pierre just showed, this if you kind of add all of the weather factors together and look at an index of dryness or drought, you kind of get a sense of how that balance has changed. And I think, looking at just the precipitation or evaporation, even though both are increasing, it's actually the relative percentage of the increases or changes between those two in the balance that will dictate the water levels itself. But we can see both precipitation and evaporation is expected to be increasing in all of the models that Environment and Climate Change Canada was looking at. Next slide, please.
So we're going to take a deeper dive into Lake Michigan Huron levels after the great overview we got from Pierre and Jane, and thank you for that. So I just want to explain what this graph is showing. So the green dotted line, you can see this is the prediction from USACE over the next 6 months. The shaded hatched red area around that shows the variability. And Jane touched on this in her presentation. At the top, you will see the maximums and minimums since the beginning of this, around 1900. Actually from the period 1918 to 2019. And the blue dotted line is the average water level on Lake Michigan Huron over this period. This is the average each month of the year. So next slide, please. Actually, don't go to the next slide. So you can go back, sorry. So you can see that water levels are currently dropping and are projected to continue their seasonal decline through to February. Usually water levels then rise March to June, but this year they did not due to low precipitation, which Pierre was explaining to us earlier. Unusually dry conditions on the Lake Superior Basin contributed to this decline in levels. Correctly applying Plan 2012 balancing protocols, the Upper Great Lakes Study Board has lowered the flow rate down St. Mary's River some time ago and continues to keep it low. Next slide. So, one thing that's happening right now is that there are 2 back-to-back La Nina years, which is increasing the potential variability. Usually the 6-month forecast is fairly accurate. That's the red dotted line here. But if you look at the red and then the purple shaded areas on this graph, you will see how actual levels could differ from this forecast. The green, yellow, and blue lines show how water levels behaved in previous similar La Nina years, but do not represent the actual levels in those years. So the upper range is the green line where there were wet conditions, and the yellow line is where there was normal conditions, and the blue line is when there were dry conditions. This unpredictability of largely climate change factors then expands the potential variability, which is the gray shaded area. So this shows that the potential range of levels for 2022, with the most likely being the red dotted line, then following the yellow line pattern, with a seasonal rise in March to June, and then a decline in July to October. But bear in mind that the range could be anywhere within that gray area. So next slide. So you've seen how much levels can vary in the short term, with the experts predicting such a wide range of potential outcomes. This is what it looks like as one moves out in time. More and more uncertainty. One question, next slide. One question we received on registration stated, prediction is easy, being correct difficult. What is the 7 to 10 year water level prediction for Georgian Bay, and with what degree of confidence? Well, as you can see from this graph, prediction is anything but easy. It is very difficult. Future modeling of water levels over the long term presents significant challenges. And the best way to do this is to apply probability scenarios to potential future water level ranges. And David will now explain how this is being done.
Yeah, just back up, Heather, for me for a second. If I could draw everybody's attention to the right extreme of the future climate, what we're looking at in this chart is a number of models, and the models are run, through the scenarios, and the outputs from those models then are graphed. And you can see there's kind of one that is showing really high peaks, just one of all of the models that was run. And the kind of bluish model on the bottom is pretty much hanging around the lowest levels of water levels. So when we're looking at the next slide, I need to draw your attention to how the different kind of presentations of data differ. So here you can actually see the individual outputs. And Heather, if you could advance, please. But here they're kind of all accumulated together in these candlesticks. And I'm going to first explain what the candlestick actually shows us. So we'll come back and look at the details around the blue and the green lines here. But in general, you can see that, that the water levels seem to be biasing in the models towards the higher side of average. And advance, please, one slide. Now, these candlesticks are showing us the maximum value of all of the models and the minimum value of all of the models, as well as the average or the median, which is just if you actually put all of the numbers in order from highest to lowest, the median is really the minimum, the middle value. It doesn't mean it's the average, it's just the middle of all of the models that you've got. And when we look at these, we're actually looking at what are called quartiles. So the first quartile is actually the value that's halfway between the median value and the minimum value. The second quartile is, in fact, the median itself. And the third quartile is the value that's halfway between the median and the maximum value. And basically the colored portion of the graph shows where 50% of the values in the range actually reside. So as I showed in that previous slide, you can have one model that gives you a maximum, but it could be kind of very high compared to all of the other models that might bulk up or range into the middle. So it's important as we look at these graphs to just kind of keep in mind that different ways of representing the data actually mean different things. You could advance, please. So now to specifically look at the projection, and this was shared at the Great Lakes Executive Committee meeting in June as a preview of this upcoming environment climate report. Basically, when we do climate modeling, we also have to decide what the climate inputs, what the carbon inputs and outputs are going to be. And so there's things called representative concentration pathways. These are kind of models of the way that humans are going to respond to climate. Are they going to keep putting out carbon? Are they going to come up with sequestration types of technologies? Are we going to reduce our carbon outputs and our greenhouse gas outputs? So these are standard kind of scenarios so that we can compare different models together. But if we apply this RCP 4.5 model through each of the decades and kind of bulk up all of the 6 climate models that were looked at, you can see here that the average or the median value is going to start to exceed the average value on average. And for each of these kind of decadal blocks, there's the possibility of both extreme water levels on the high side and extreme water levels on the low side. Now, there's nothing assigning the probabilities yet to these very extremes, like the tops of the bars or the bottoms. But it does indicate that the variability, the unpredictability is increasing. And as people who are involved with coastal infrastructure management or property management, or looking at protecting your own family and your own investments, it's important to understand the range of these possibilities so that you can take appropriate mitigating actions. And some of those resiliency pieces that Jane was talking about are going to be very important. And we'll be specifically talking about examples of those in webinar 2 and also in webinar 3. So as we go into the future, we can see the possibility of exceeding even the all-time record lows, which is that bottom red line, what we've experienced historically. And the upper red line is the historically experienced maximums, which basically were around the 2020 and 2019 and 2020 year. And you'll see some of these models are predicting that we'll be well above those levels. And if you move forward one more slide, please. This is an even more extreme lack of response, let's say, to greenhouse gases by society, RCP 8.5. This basically is a model that's built around what happens if we just keep going as per normal and don't really take any mitigative actions on climate change. And you can see here that the extreme range actually gets even higher variability. But again, largely, the water levels are looking like they will be in between the historic average and the extreme highs that we've experienced to date. But as we get out into the future, this uncertainty starts to increase, and you can see the possibility for really extreme levels. But again, the highest of these would be about 7 feet above the all-time ever recorded high level, but that's only one of the models that showed that. Not all of the other 7 models was showing that kind of information. So when Environment Canada comes out with the full report in 2022, we will have them speak specifically to what this means. But having seen this really over the last 2 years, Rupert and I both have been pretty concerned that this information has not yet made its way officially out into the public. So it's important to start to keep in mind, as Pierre said, we can't be complacent. Things are changing, the variability is getting bigger. And if you want to protect your families and your property, you're going to really need to internalize this information and take it seriously. So next slide, please. Again, going out into the future, there is more uncertainty. The models are variable, and you can see the range of models here that the Environment Canada report is trying to take all of those and put them together and give us a sense of what the future conditions are going to look like. So there is some definite need for keeping our eye on this, system. And finally, there are real life impacts to this, in that there is currently the Vertical Control Water Levels Subcommittee, which is the coordinating committee on the Great Lakes Basin hydraulic and hydrologic data. And they are currently examining the low water datum. And the data that they're using is the historic data. And in doing, trying to figure out what the chart datum on your nautical charts is going to look like, they have to come up with a value that is not typically exceeded so that shipping and navigation can safely operate. They're currently assessing this and looking at dropping the low water datum by 9 to 12 inches. That 9 to 12 inches would have some significant impacts, for example, on the seaway and the way that the US Army Corps is charged and regulated with maintaining it. If the low water datum is lowered by 9 to 12 inches, that would mean that the channel would have to be dredged to make sure that the minimum depth below the new low water datum is 27 feet. And that could cause a change in the riverine conveyance of the St. Clair River or any of the connecting channels. And that can also have an impact on the water levels of the current lake level. And that new regime could possibly lower the actual water level regime too. So without talking about these potential future impacts and recognizing that, hey, the future model is suggesting that water levels may actually be higher on average. If we just look back in time at the historic data and only use that as part of the risk modeling, it could have very real life significant impacts on the Lake Michigan, Huron, and other Great Lakes water level regimes. So this is incredibly important information to get out and share, even amongst the existing agencies within Environment Canada and on the US side too.
Okay, so thank you very much, David. Thanks again for Pierre and Jane for their presentation. So we will now have a question period, and the four of us will form a panel. To kick that off, we had a number of questions that were put forward on registration. We're just going to start dealing with those. The first one was, what was last year's high water mark compared to the 100-year? And the answer is, in the last 100 years, it was only higher in October 1986. This is on Michigan Huron. What was this year's high water mark? The highest level in 2021 was in January, where it was around 20 inches below the 2020 high. What was the lowest since 1990? That was 576.1 feet above sea level in 2013. What is the forecast for winter and spring water level? Please refer to the GBA water levels reports, but as we saw earlier, we're looking at water levels gradually decreasing through February and then coming back up again in March to June. That would be the normal structure. Where did all the water go this year? Extreme drought conditions in Lake Superior Basin and less rain has lowered water levels in all the Great Lakes in 2021. And what's the next one? Okay. Is there any chance of an accurate water level forecast for more than 3 months? Well, the answer is that we do get pretty accurate forecasts for 6 months. Beyond that, it becomes much more of a guessing game and much more difficult to predict what water levels will be. Levels dropped close to 2 feet in 2021. No, they didn't. The average, on the whole, the difference from the previous month in 2020 for months in 2021 has been between 12 and 18 inches. It never was as high as 2 feet. How can Lake Huron, Michigan Lake drop 22 inches in one calendar year? It hasn't. So as I just stated, only 12 to 18 inches on the whole. Has the high water level peaked for this winter? Yes, according to the short-term predictions, which we saw earlier. What might the levels move down? Well, they're moving down right now, and we expect that to continue through to February. So the next questions, David, for you, the Christie Beach one.
Yeah, so the conditions at Christie Beach are conditions that have been experienced inside of the historical range, which, you know, we've gone a little bit above and certainly below in 2013. So as future water level regimes are imposed on that, if those future water levels are above those extremes, then if those extreme levels will increase at that location. But really, it just depends what the base conditions are, and that will continue to change and become more variable, as we've just seen.
And then, David, there's a couple of other questions there. As water levels continue to fluctuate, can we expect greater extremes in seiches as well? Yeah,
so the same thing. A seiche is based around where the current water level is. So at any time, if there's a seiche, which can happen in Georgian Bay, the water levels can change rapidly, but around that current water level. So if there was an extreme high water level condition and a seiche on top of that, the water levels would change appropriately. But the impact is kind of additive to each of these things onto whatever the base water level is.
So the next question is also for you. Would a broad archaeological history, many millennia of Georgian Bay water levels, be helpful in our search for understanding current trends?
I don't think we've ever seen the imposition of the climate change energies on the basin historically. So there are studies that have been done, historical kind of paleolimnological studies that have been done, and you know, wave ridges and beach ridges and things like that have been examined. And we know that the water levels have changed in the basin historically because of, you know, melting glaciers and rebounding of the Earth's surface. But those are pretty outside of the inputs now that have happened based on the energies in the atmosphere and the instability that we've been introducing over the last 40 or 50 years, or even longer.
Sorry. Next, we had about 20 questions related to future projections of water levels, all of which have just been dealt with in the presentations. And now there's a couple of new ones. Is it accurate that elevated temperatures in the north are causing permafrost to melt and add to the water in the watershed? David, either if you want to address that or ask what somebody else on the panel.
Yeah, so that would be kind of a complicated answer, but certainly we are seeing permafrost melting in the north. And we know that as the permafrost is exposed even, the albedo or the reflectivity of the Arctic changes, which allows for more energy to be absorbed, but it's a pretty complicated link.
The next one is winds can have a devastating effect. Do the models only factor the rainfall? How can wind be incorporated into these data sets? David? David, you okay for that one?
Yeah, again, these are part of the modeling that's done. And I think that the details of those answers will come out as we start to get to query Environment Canada early next year.
Okay, so I think the next one is for either Pierre or Jane. Are there specific legislative efforts you recommend to alleviate climate change on both sides of the border? Also, are there other predictions about water being taken from Michigan, Huron, and Georgian Bay and the other lakes as US and other country water continues to become more depleted? So Pierre, do you want to, or Jane, can you have a go at that one?
Pierre, you're on mute.
The first question is about legislation. Could you repeat it? Legislation
sure.
To do what?
Are there specific legislative efforts you recommend to alleviate climate change on both sides of the border?
That is a big question. It's a good question, but a big question. Specific legislation that would control carbon emissions or that would favor the removal of carbon from the air. This is outside of my field of expertise, but everyone knows that we have to do something. But if there are any legislation that are being considered for any of the specific actions, for example, you could say that favoring electric automobiles, there is a program in Quebec, to provide a sum of money to people who are buying electric cars. That would be one measure, but this will not be sufficient. We need additional. We have to turn society upside down, basically, in order to be able to reduce our emissions to the point where we will prevent climate change. And even then, if we stop right now to emit carbon throughout the world, the global warming will continue for a while. It will take years and years because the process is already engaged and we cannot stop the climate or the atmosphere from warming up, but we can prevent it from warming up beyond a certain level. I cannot really, this is an impossible question to answer. I would have to have a list of legislation throughout Canada, provinces, municipalities are providing some effort as well. But I mean, I cannot answer that.
Thanks, Pierre. I think that was a great answer. I think the next one is really for Jane. Are there other predictions about water being taken from Michigan, Huron, and Georgian Bay and the other lakes as US and other country water continues to become more depleted?
Thanks, Rupert. Yes, and I noticed there's another question related to that as well about decreasing water flows in the US. I'm glad this question came up because I think it's important for everyone to understand that we have between the United States and Canada the Boundary Waters Treaty. And in that treaty, which created the International Joint Commission, it very specifically states that any efforts to divert or affect natural flows of waters across the boundary has to be approved by us and the government. So we do have that stopgap. A bottling company in Illinois can't come in, take water out of the lake without getting clearance from us. So that's important. But I do also want to raise the specter here. If you see what's happened in California and some of the Western states that have water agreements with each other, agreements are great until things start to get really diminished and people's needs really come to the forefront. So I would say that it's very important that we're mindful of the agreements we have, to make sure we strengthen those agreements, make sure that we monitor the efforts of people in the area. And that's certainly the role of the IJC. So unfortunately, I think going forward, given the climate predictions, the IJC's role is going to become more and more important on the boundary as far as making sure those water levels are managed to the benefits of both countries.
Thank you so much, Jane. I'm afraid that's all the time we have for questions. As indicated, we will answer all questions later that have not been answered at this time. So moving on to the next section. Over the years, we've seen interest in water levels wax and wane. As Pierre was referring to earlier, you know, the interest does vary, and we cannot afford to be complacent. These interest waxes when water levels hit extremes, such as the low lows in 2013, and then it wanes when water levels come back up until we get to an extreme high, as we did in 2019, when once again, interest ratcheted up significantly. We can no longer afford to do this. You've seen what is likely to be coming at us, or a snapshot of that. We'll get more information next year. Complacency is simply not an option. We must try and find solutions. But we are fortunate today to have with us two organizations who will help us on this. Severn Sound Environmental Association has a role and a structure that is similar to a conservation authority. It was originally founded in 1997 as a partnership between federal, provincial, and municipal partners to support the completion of the Severn Sound Remedial Action Plan and to provide a local community-based environmental office in the Severn Sound area. The SSEA provides continuing support to the federal and provincial agencies, but particularly to the local municipalities, to sustain environmental quality and to ensure continued protection through wise stewardship of Severn Sound and its tributaries. You will hear from their executive director, Cayley, and water scientist, Aisha Chiandet, later. But coming up next is Council of the Great Lakes Regions, President and CEO, Mark Fisher. CGLR provides a binational multi-sector forum for exchange and collaboration on the region's key risks and opportunities. Beginning with conversations about the region's most critical issues, the Council encourages those with common interests to drive commitment and action through dialogue, groups, research, advocacy, and programs. Prior to joining CGLR in 2014, Mark served as a foreign policy advisor in the Privy Council Office, which supports the Prime Minister of Canada and the Federal Cabinet, where he focused on advancing Canada's interests in North America and the Asia-Pacific region. Mark has extensive experience advising senior decision makers on a range of socio-economic and environmental issues facing government, business, and the non-profit sector. In addition to CGLR, Mark is a member of the International Joint Commission's Great Lakes Water Quality Board, manages to find time for other interests, and is a recipient of the Royal Canadian Legion Cadet Medal of Excellence. So please take it away, Mark, and tell us about Action Plan 2030.
Thank you for that kind introduction, Rupert, and thank you for inviting me today, along with Georgian Bay Forever, David Sweetnam, two long-standing and great partners of the Council of the Great Lakes region. So it's a pleasure to be here on a Saturday morning, a sunny day in Ottawa, and spending some time to talk to you about both the Council of the Great Lakes region, but also our involvement and work with a collaboration called the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Action Plan 2020-2030. For those of you who aren't as familiar with the Council of the Great Lakes region, as Rupert mentioned, we were launched in 2013. We are a nonprofit organization, a binational organization. We really are a forum where the region comes together as one. Two countries, United States and Canada, 8 Great Lakes states, New York to Minnesota, the Canadian provinces of Ontario and Quebec, and countless numbers of cities and other municipalities. But it's also where industry comes together with all levels of government, local, state, provincial, federal, alongside academia, the broader nonprofit sector, to really do two things. One is to think more strategically about the Great Lakes region as a shared economy, and how do we work together across borders and sectors to improve our long-term economic success and competitiveness. This region is by far North America's economic engine. But also, how do we work together across borders and sectors to protect the Great Lakes, protect the environment, and ultimately, how do we build a more sustainable future for the Great Lakes region? And so I'm here to talk to you today about the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Action Plan, which again is a collaboration between not only the Council of the Great Lakes region, but Freshwater Future, the Great Lakes Fisheries Commission, the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Cities Initiative, Freshwater Future Strategy St. Laurent, and working alongside Environment Canada. Next slide, please. So the overarching goals of the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Collaborative. So we really started this collaborative in 2017, and the impetus for this collaboration was the fact that since 2009 in the United States, the 8 states, the federal governments, a number of different NGOs and universities and colleges came together as part of a Great Lakes regional collaboration to really look at how the United States is working together to invest in, protect, and restore the Great Lakes as part of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, but also beyond. And that initiative led to what we all know today as the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, which over the last 10 years has invested $2 billion plus in federal dollars in investing and protecting the Great Lakes region. This doesn't account for state investments. This doesn't account for investments from, other agencies and research dollars. So a significant investment has occurred on the United States side. So inspired by that collaboration, inspired by that investment, the organizations that I just mentioned came together to really start thinking about and pushing for and advocating for a similar kind of integrated vision, not only for the Great Lakes, but also the St. Lawrence River. And ultimately a vision where we could prioritize issues, but also adopt innovative approaches to addressing those issues like climate change, which we've talked about this morning. How do we encourage alignment across not only the federal government, but alignment between the federal government, the provincial government of Ontario and the provincial government of Quebec, municipalities, and also working with our Indigenous partners across the region? How do we do a better job of engaging those stakeholders and experts and those First Nations communities? Next slide, please. So the conversation really started in earnest in 2017 with roundtables in both Toronto and Quebec. It culminated in what we called the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Day on Parliament Hill, where we had an opportunity to meet with then Minister of the Environment, Catherine McKenna, in 2017. And the proposal to Environment and Climate Change Canada at the time was, help provide some funding to this collaboration and allow us to really engage, create a forum, engage stakeholders in the Great Lakes along the St. Lawrence River to identify those priorities, to identify those opportunities where we can create that integrated vision, that Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, and focus it on Canada. And so we were pleased that the Environment and Climate Change Canada did provide funding, $400,000 towards the project in September 2018. And from there, we really started to build the structure of this review, which on the Great Lakes was led by Gord Miller, who a lot of people on this call will know, but also Jean Cinq-Mars in Quebec. And both of them brought together expert panels and issue tables, again, to start the conversation about where we need to be putting our focus in both the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River. This work that spanned over 2 years really culminated in 3 reports: a Great Lakes Action Plan 2030, which was launched in 2019, the Action Plan for the Future of the St. Lawrence, which was launched in March 2020, and then an integrated report that we put together for both the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence in May 2020. Next slide, please. And so again, this just highlights the 3 phases of the work over 18 months, again, starting with Great Lakes in the 2018-2019 phase, ending with the integrated review in January 2020 and April 2020. Next slide, please. Next slide. Next slide. I'm going to skip over some slides because I have 10 minutes and I want to get to the substance of the presentation. Next slide, please. Next slide. And so during the process in the Great Lakes, and I'll focus on the Great Lakes because this is a Georgian Bay convening, we were able to engage over 80 experts directly on different topics, from climate change and toxics and looking at algae and other issues. We hosted 24 meetings with 4 issue tables. We had a number of different webinars and a summit at the end of it all where we engaged over 110 participants. So a lot of engagement from different members, from across the Great Lakes, including Georgian Bay Association and Georgian Bay Forever. Next slide, please. Next slide. Next slide. So ultimately, in terms of the challenges for the region, we settled on 4, and the 4 parallel quite nicely with the 4 priorities identified in the U.S. Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. So first, climate change, which wouldn't be a surprise to a lot of the participants today. Beaches, and looking at bacteriological contamination of beaches. Nutrients, we've certainly all read and we're becoming more and more aware about nutrients and algae problems in the Great Lakes region. And then finally, the 4th priority was toxics and harmful pollutants. Next slide, please. And so when we think about climate change, again, we spent most of the morning talking about, high water levels, low water levels. Georgian Bay has seen it all, and particularly in the 2017 and 2019 timeframes where we've seen lake and river levels reach historical highs. We also have to remember between the period of 2007 roughly to 2014, we also saw the lowest of the lows. And so with those fluctuations, we've seen flooding problems, erosion problems, and infrastructure damage. And so, through this work and doing some further investigations on what the United States has done around climate change, we thought that we would focus on 4 to 5 Great Lakes regions that were particularly impacted by the fluctuating water levels. So in this case, it's Chatham, Kent, and Leamington on the Lake Erie shoreline, between Amberley to Grand Bend on Lake Huron, between the city of Toronto and Prince Edward County on Lake Ontario, and then between Fort William First Nation and Thunder Bay on Lake Superior, and then finally between Penetanguishene and the tiny township on Georgian Bay. We also investigated pervasive flooding along the St. Lawrence River, particularly at the outflows of Lake Ontario and Montreal and Quebec City and further afar. Next slide, please. So in terms of some of the analysis we looked at in terms of not the problem on the Canadian side, but also what are some of the recommendations, what are some actions that we can undertake. We looked at the experience on the U.S. side, the work it was doing through the National Coastal Zone Management Program, which has been around since 1972. The United States also has regional coastal zone management programs in the Great Lakes region, and lots of work around modeling for shoreline priority zones. Next slide, please. So that ultimately led us to a number of recommendations for municipalities as it relates to climate change. The first recommendation was to establish a joint office on shoreline climate change, adaptation, and resilience in order to develop a shoreline adaptation and resiliency strategy, but also provincial action plans both in Ontario and Quebec when it comes to coordinating and implementing measures as it relates to adaptation and resiliency, and to fund shoreline resiliency priority zones and management teams. Next slide, please. Beaches and bacteriological contamination. We have lots of great beaches. Unfortunately, 15 to 20% of the beaches have chronic E. coli contamination. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So some of the key recommendations that we've developed and put forward to government included developing a risk-based categorization system for the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence beaches, developing a central portal with beach quality information, doesn't exist today, but also allowing for alternate testing methods so we can get faster, better insights about what's happening in our beaches. Next slide, please. Toxics and other harmful pollutants. So the effects of substances that are not on the Canadian Environmental Protection Toxic Substances list often go undetected for years in the environment. Through broad surveillance, these effects can be detected and the cause of these effects can be investigated. Next slide, please. So in terms of next slide, please, key recommendations for the area of toxics and other harmful pollutants, we suggested and recommended to government that we develop a targeted environmental and human health effects monitoring, human biomonitoring and surveillance program, that we should be upgrading the performance of existing wastewater treatment facilities for businesses and municipalities and other institutions, and also to develop a strategy to promote the substitution of harmful chemicals. Next slide, please. Nutrients and algae blooms. We all know the story of algae blooms and increasing nutrients. Today, it's a problem that is largely arising as a result of combined sewer overflows, but also non-point source pollution from our farms. Next slide, please. Next slide. So in terms of key recommendations in nutrients and algae blooms, we recommended establishing a Center for Water Quality and Nutrient Management, working with farmers to review and adapt the agriculture income support and technical programs so they can reduce their water contamination, but also then developing a dedicated network of extension workers, on-farm workers that can work alongside farmers and provide them technical advice in terms of their operations and sustainability. Next slide, please. This also included recommendations in terms of increasing provincial support for wastewater treatment facility upgrades, but also the installation of green infrastructure that can have a positive impact on reducing nutrients and sewer overflows. Next slide, please. Next slide. Next slide. So where do we go from here? We were pleased during the last election that a number of parties talked about the importance of water and fresh water in Canada. The Liberal Party, which was re-elected, as everyone knows, made some substantial commitments in its platform. So right now, as we look at the recommendations coming from Action Plan 2030, our goal is to try and leverage those federal commitments regarding a strengthened freshwater action plan and the creation of a Canada Water Agency to advance the Action Plan 2030 priorities as laid out by the collaborative. You know, as we move into the fall and the new government starts talking about the speech from the throne, budget 2021, and the establishment of the Canada Water Agency, I think the priority is to meet with key minister, caucuses, shoreline MPs, senators in advance of the speech from the throne and budget 2021, just to make sure that these freshwater commitments in the Great Lakes remains a top priority for the Trudeau government in a minority parliament, particularly as we move into 2022, which will be the 50th anniversary of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. So I want to wrap up there. I think I've come to the end of my 10 minutes. There's a lot of information in the slides that I didn't speak to today, which will be shared with participants. If there are questions about the work that we're doing on Action Plan 2030, the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement and beyond, feel free to email me directly at mark@councilgreatlakesregion.org, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. That was truly excellent. We do have one question that came through. Is what types of investments has the US $2 billion supported?
Well, generally, we know that the government itself has invested $2 billion over the last 10 years, and research that has been done on the US side has said that for every dollar that's been invested in protection and restoration, has generated an ROI roughly between $3 to $4. So a significant ROI from that dollar invested in restoration.
Okay, thank you. Another question is, what are the main causes of bacteriological contamination of beaches, sewage and runoff near beaches, or beach activity swimming itself, or something else?
Sure. It really depends on where you are, Rupert. You know, if you're along Lake Ontario, for example, it could be combined sewer overflow. So when we have heavy rain events and the systems just can't absorb the rainfall, you know, obviously there's a lot of flushing that goes into the lakes. There's a lot of animal life and bird life that have their own droppings on beaches that can certainly lead to contamination. And then, you know, we're also looking at non-point sources of pollution. If you have large farm operations upstream where, let's say, cattle has access to streams, or, you know, improper, you know, sort of manure spreading on fields and on farm fields, you know, all of that can find its way in our water courses and unfortunately sometimes to our beaches.
Okay, and the final question is, what would a resolution from municipalities directed towards the federal government help support Plan 2030?
Well, I think ultimately at this time, knowing that there is a commitment from the Liberal Party of Canada, the Trudeau government, for a strengthened freshwater action plan and for a Canada Water Agency, I think a positive resolution from a municipality could be, you know, how do we take these priorities from the Action Plan 2030 and just reinforce to the government that these priorities are important for municipalities and that they can be part of a strengthened freshwater action plan. And I would be happy to work with the municipalities on that language if that's helpful.
I think that's all we have time for. Thank you so much, Mark. That was fantastic. Julie, can I hand it over to you? Or to David? I think David's going to introduce Julie. Sorry, David's going to introduce Julie.
Yes, I am. So we're now going to talk about the impacts on wetlands, flora, and fauna. And I wanted to introduce Julie Cayley. Julie is working with us on this webinar series, collaborating with us. And Julie is the executive director of Severn Sound Environmental Association. And you heard Rupert kind of describe the organization. Julie is a government and industry relations expert with a significant background in creating successful connections within government, industry, and the not-for-profit space. Over her career, she's worked for the provincial government and NGOs, as well as running her own consulting business. And she specializes in environment and conservation, especially in agriculture and with rural partnerships. And she has a passion for working with communities on the Great Lakes and for Georgian Bay. Over to you, Julie.
Thank you, David. Can everybody hear me okay?
Perfect.
Awesome. So we're pretty excited to be partnering with GBF and GBA today on this really important webinar series. And I just want to thank all of you out there for joining us. I've been watching the participant numbers and it's such an amazing turnout, especially for a Saturday morning. So thank you all. We've actually, as the SSEA, been working in Severn Sound, and that's the southeast portion of Georgian Bay, Rupert mentioned, since the 1980s. Really seeing it through delisting as one of the Great Lakes areas of concern, and now with the vision of making this area the most resilient and thriving Great Lakes watershed. So we have a big vision, and we're looking forward to working with everybody to make that happen. And events like this webinar series are really helping advance our collective knowledge, empowering us all to protect the waters that are so important to us, obviously. The session, as David mentioned, is going to be looking at the impacts we're actually seeing on wetlands, flora, and fauna. And our speakers are going to be Aisha Chiandet, the SSEA's super water scientist, and David Sweetnam, who you've already met, the ED of Georgian Bay Forever. So first, we're going to hear from Aisha. And Aisha is a graduate with a Bachelor of Environmental Science from the University of Guelph and a Master's of Science in Watershed Ecosystems from Trent University. And she's co-authored and authored several peer-reviewed scientific papers and has been providing water quality expertise for the SSEA for over 10 years now. And she's going to share her firsthand knowledge of the trends and changes she and her team are seeing in monitoring data that they collect and that has been collected over the last 30 years in the Severn Sound watershed. Aisha also leads the SSEA's citizen science programs with goals to monitor the impacts of climate change, algae growth, and water level fluctuations. And she'll be providing an overview of the trends being observed for southern Georgian Bay and water temperature, precipitation, and wind, and the impacts that this is all having on ice, algae growth, and our water level fluctuations. And then after Aisha, we're going to hear from David Sweetnam again. And you've already met David, a passionate, talented leader and Georgian Bay advocate, and he's going to be reviewing the impacts on wetlands, flora, and fauna in recent extreme high and low water level eras, providing an explanation and impact of new mapping technologies being used, as well as the status of research and what needs to be done to understand future impacts. So welcome to you both. And Aisha, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks, Julie. Good morning, everyone, and thanks to GBA and GBF for this opportunity to speak to you on climate trends that SSEA has been observing in the Severn Sound area through our climate and water quality monitoring programs, and also trends using more regional data sets. Next slide, please. So I'll first describe climate drivers that impact lakes, namely air temperature and its corresponding influence on water temperature, and also go into wind speed and precipitation trends. These can operate at both local scales like the Severn Sound watershed level and more regional scales like the entire Great Lakes Basin. So using rainfall as an example, we can look at the trends affecting just the southern Georgian Bay area that may impact things like water quality and algae, but also need to take into account what's happening across the whole Great Lakes Basin when we look at something like water levels, as has been talked about. The second part of my talk will deal with impacts of climate drivers on ice cover, algae growth, and water levels. And I'll be focusing mostly on Severn Sound, although many of these trends are occurring widely across the Georgian Bay area. For each driver and impact, I'll touch on local and regional trends and look at implications for change, as well as forecasted trends based on modeled climate projections. Next slide, please. So just to get you oriented, Severn Sound is a collection of bays in the southeastern corner of Georgian Bay, and the watershed covers Tiny Township over to Aurelia, up into Honey Harbor area, and south down towards Elmville. So the water temperature, nutrient, and algae data that I will be showing today was collected from 5 long-term monitoring stations in Severn Sound, which are shown in the large red circles here. We collected data at all of the sites shown here, but our long-term sites go back to the late 1960s, early 1970s, which gives us a much better data set to look at some of these long-term trends. Sites are monitored each year during the ice-free season from May to October and are sampled every 2 weeks. Next slide, please. So let's jump right in and start with temperature. Many folks are probably already aware that air temperature across the region is increasing, and you can see that on the top graph as the change from long-term average across Ontario. In Severn Sound, our long-term monitoring data shown on the lower graph indicates that surface waters have been warming at a rate of about 0.4 degrees Celsius per decade, which may not sound like a lot, but in ecosystem terms, that's pretty substantial. When we look at just the October water temperatures, that rate of warming actually doubles to nearly 0.9 degrees Celsius per decade. And so this fall temperature increase can really fuel some of the late season algae growth and can actually lead to delay in ice formation as well. Warm temperatures across the entire region can result in earlier ice off and leads to more growing days and a longer window for algae blooms to occur. Climate models using the business as usual scenario, so that 8.5 RCP, projects that air temperatures in the region are going to increase. So we can expect some of these trends in water temperature to increase as well. Next slide, please. Wind speed is a difficult variable to look at in trends, and partly due to inconsistencies in historical data sets. But a study that was done in 2010 that combined wind data from Environment and Climate Change Canada weather stations across Ontario showed that average wind speeds are actually decreasing, as you can see in the lower graph there. So this may be surprising, but yeah, this is what they found, and it can actually have an effect on surface waters, making them calmer and warmer overall, which can favor algae growth, particularly in terms of blue-green algae. So you may think that it actually seems windier in recent years, and we have seen an increase in storm events and associated strong winds, which is kind of what we're noticing. And these are interspersed among calmer periods. So these strong wind events can cause the short-term water level fluctuation, which are known as seshes, sort of that sloshing back and forth of water that occurs kind of in a shorter time scale. And these can lead to coastal flooding and erosion, particularly in combination with high water levels. The top graph here shows wind speeds from the Western Island as the black line there, and the corresponding effect on water levels at 4 locations in Southern Georgian Bay. So this is over a very short time scale, so you can kind of see there's a bit of a lag effect, but really that increase in wind speed that is driving the short-term fluctuation in water level. Wind-driven mixing in shallower waters can also cause sediment and nutrients to get stirred up, adding further fuel for algae growth. The projection is for average wind speed to continue to decline, but for the frequency and intensity of storms to rise. Next slide, please. Precipitation is highly variable from location to location, but we know that on a Great Lakes Basin scale, there's a general increasing trend in precipitation. The fluctuations from year to year have an impact on water level changes, as we saw in Pierre's discussion. We know that we're seeing more frequent and more intense storm events that bring pulses of nutrients into water bodies, which are interspersed by these calm drought periods. These conditions do favor algae growth, and in particular, blue-green algae blooms. We're seeing more rainfall in the winter months as well, which has an impact in terms of runoff and nutrient inputs, both from rural and urban landscapes. As you can see in the top graph, showing annual median and, annual measured and modeled precipitation for Midland area, rainfall amount is expected to increase in the future. And as shown on the bottom graph, the heavy precipitation events are also forecasted to rise. Next slide, please. So switching gears and looking at the trends in climate impacts on lakes that we're observing. So we'll start with ice cover and phenology, which is really just a fancy word that means timing. So across Lake Huron, there has been a decrease in the maximum annual ice cover, as shown in the top graph there. And then more locally, the ice phenology, or when ice forms and breaks up, is changing. So the longest data set that we have in Severn Sound is for Lake Couchiching ice out. So about a 100-year data set, which is pretty amazing. And so we're seeing a shift to earlier breakup in the springtime. So you can see on the bottom graph that there's quite a lot of variability from year to year, but on average, the ice goes out about 5 days earlier than it did about 100 years ago. So again, looks like a small change, but ecologically, that's pretty substantial. For lakes of all sizes, the length of the ice cover season influences water balance and water levels, and also the potential for erosion during times when ice is not present to protect the shoreline in the winter. A shorter ice cover season also means a longer growing season for both aquatic plants and algae. And in the future, we do expect to see a decrease in ice cover and gradual shortening of that ice cover season. Next slide. So taking a look at some of the changes we're seeing in algae in Severn Sound, we know that warmer and calmer waters favors blue-green algae growth, and this type of algae has the potential to produce toxins or cause taste and odor issues in drinking water. In the open waters, we've been observing an increasing presence of blue-green algae later in the season, which you can see on the bar charts on the left-hand side there, showing seasonal algae biomass. The colors presented represent different classes of algae, and the one to focus in on here is the cyanophytes, circled in blue, also known as blue-green algae. So the shift in dominance is occurring despite long-term reductions and more recent plateaus in phosphorus concentrations, which you can see in the graph down below. There's also more research looking at the role of nitrogen in blue-green algae formation, and we know that nitrate concentrations are rising in parts of Severn Sound. So there's likely more to this story here than what meets the eye. The frequency of algae blooms is expected to increase with rising water temperatures and also with more frequent and intense storm and drought cycles. Next slide. So you're pretty familiar with the water level story, so I'll just point out a couple of things kind of as they relate to some of the climate drivers that I've talked about. So while the short-term wind events cause the short-term fluctuations in water levels, these longer-term changes really are due to the basin-wide scale factors such as precipitation, which Pierre talked about, and also evaporation. And these things have links to air temperature, wind speed, and ice cover. So the graph here is showing the seasonal water levels from the gauge in Midland, and you can see where we're currently sitting in 2021, which thankfully is lower than in past years. The impacts of high and low water levels really vary depending on the shoreline area, and range from flooding and erosion to habitat loss or gain, depending on the wetland situation, and also property damage. The shifts between the extremes are projected to occur more rapidly, and we're expecting that these differences between highs and lows is projected to rise. Next slide. So these trends and projections may seem pretty doom and gloom, but there are ways you can take action to protect your property if you're lucky enough to have a place on the lake, and to protect the lake regardless of where you live. So on the waterfront, it's really important to think about how you can invest in resilient shorelines using nature-based solutions. So you might hear this referred to as bioengineering or soft engineering or green infrastructure. So it's all kind of referring to using natural systems to help reinforce the shoreline and absorb really as much wave energy as possible and as much nutrient runoff as possible. Kind of a win-win there. If you have the opportunity and the means, it's also important to start thinking about relocating any vulnerable infrastructure such as septic systems or buildings away from shorelines whenever possible. We need to get serious about reducing nutrient inputs and also carbon emissions. And I encourage you to check out some of the resources that we have on both of our websites here. And you can also calculate your carbon footprint using the tool that was developed by Georgian Bay Biosphere, which is unique in that it actually takes emissions from recreational vehicles and boats into account. So that's pretty cool. It's important to learn how to spot and report harmful algae, which you touched on a fair bit here. So we have really great video about this on our YouTube channel. And we also have identification tips and resources on the SSCA website. And finally, I would encourage you to report things that you are observing on the landscape through either one of our citizen science programs, or if you're outside the Severn Sound watershed, there are programs run by other agencies that you can also check out. So the more we know about the impacts that are occurring on the landscape, the better we can manage them. Next slide. So to conclude, we know that there are impacts on lakes occurring due to climate change through many and often interacting processes that act at basin-wide and also local scales. We know the major climate drivers include temperature, wind, and precipitation. And to quote David Phillips from Environment Canada, future projections predict that climate in our region will be warmer, wetter, and wilder. Local effects that have been observed include reduced ice cover and shorter ice season, increased algae growth in some areas or increasing dominance by blue-green algae, and increased variability in both short and long-term water level fluctuations. It will likely be necessary to reduce nutrient inputs even further in this warmer and stormier world. And in order to reduce nuisance and harmful algae growth, and we will need to adapt and mitigate against climate impacts by making shorelines more resilient and reducing both emissions and nutrient inputs. Next slide. So I'll just wrap up by acknowledging the support that we receive from our municipal partners across the Severn Sound watershed, as well as the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks, and all the fantastic SSCA staff that make this work possible. Next slide. So I thank you all for your attention. Encourage you to check us out on social media and check out some of the resources that we have both on our website and our YouTube channel. And I'll wrap up and turn it over to David.
Thanks, Aisha. So I think I just wanted to set the context slightly here, because earlier I was mentioning this representative concentration pathway of 4.5 and 8.5, and those are the kind of modeled outputs that the Environment and Climate Change Canada study will be looking at. So Heather, if you could go to the next slide. This is a representation that just came out last week from Climate Central, looking at what those different RCPs actually mean. And this is the Santa Monica Pier down in California. That's kind of a famous end of Route 66. The current goal or aspirational goal from the Paris Accord is actually for RCP 1.9. So Heather, could you advance? And that means about a 1.5 degrees Celsius increase in global temperature. This is the aspiration, and you can see that there's a significant impact from just that aspirational RCP limitation. If we go to 4.5, which was just kind of the entry point of what we were talking about on the modeling that Environment and Climate Change Canada is showing, this is RCP 4.5, about a 3-degree temperature increase. And you can see effectively the Santa Monica Pier is completely submerged. The Ferris wheel sticking up out of the water. So these RCPs are very kind of significant in their global impacts and what it's going to mean. And we certainly can't be complacent, because I don't think just attaining RCP 4.5 would make people too happy. So when we talk globally about trying to limit the increase in global temperature to below 1.5 or potentially 2 degrees, because 1.5 looks like it's baked in already. We really do mean significant impacts in our watersheds and around the world. Next slide. Our coastal wetlands in Georgian Bay, really, starting from the lakeside and moving towards the land, are the zones where we have plant communities, some of which are submerged under the water all the time, some that come up and kind of float on the surface, and then some that start to actually emerge out of the lake itself. So these are the different zones, and they include the shrubs and the forests surrounding the lakes. So when water levels increase, we actually expect times where the shrubbery around the water is going to be flooded, and other times when the water levels decrease, that these plant communities are going to kind of migrate in and out from the shorelines. Next slide. These coastal wetlands are pretty extensive in the Georgian Bay area. And this is some data that Michigan Tech Research Institute has put out. Next slide. You can see surrounding Georgian Bay, we just have an enormous number of wetlands. And these are some of the healthiest wetlands in all of the world, and especially the Great Lakes. Next slide. Wetlands, of course, provide protection from wave action. The roots of the plants stabilize the soils along the shore. And also the plants themselves that are in the water can help kind of dissipate the wave energy. Our wetlands provide services that filter and clean the water, habitat for fish and other wildlife, including migrating birds. Our wetlands in Georgian Bay have evolved within the long-term water level fluctuation regime of about 6.3 feet in Lake Michigan, Huron. So our wetlands are used to those kind of fluctuations, and where they have established themselves, they're quite healthy and able to accommodate those changes in water levels. But the question is now, do these more rapid fluctuations, these rapid changes between the low water regime and the high water, do those actually have some adverse impacts? And there's a lot of research that still needs to be done there. Wetlands do include the forest fringe. So occasional dead trees are part of Mother Nature's plan. And of course, there's nothing more iconic than to see a basking turtle on a tree that's fallen into the water. Next. A study that was put out of the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry in 2018 indicated that climate change will affect the distribution and abundance of species in the Ontario Great Lakes. They assessed about 280 species in the Great Lakes waters, and they used RCP 4.5, which again is that same modeling that Environment Canada will be producing on climate change forecasts. Next slide. Of those 280 species, they found that 175 of them would be vulnerable to climate change. 11 were extremely vulnerable, 49 were highly vulnerable, 115 were moderately vulnerable, and the remaining 105 were found to be less vulnerable, but not unaffected. And in the taxonomic groups that they looked at, kind of fish or amphibians or mammals or so on, what they found was that those species that depend most on the water are the most vulnerable. Next slide, please. So climate change is something that must be taken into consideration when we're looking at managing species at risk, when the investments we're making in coastal wetland protection are occurring, and in how we look at ensuring that there is biodiversity and a distribution of healthy ecosystems throughout our watershed. And some of this data, Georgian Bay Forever was starting to build a DNA barcode database of the biodiversity, all of the species that exist in Great Lakes water, in Georgian Bay specifically. Next slide. We did some work about almost 8 years ago with NASA. And what we looked at was what happened between the water levels that were extremely high in the 1980s, 1987, and 2013, when we experienced the all-time record lows. What did happen to wetland coverage of around a 10-kilometer margin of Georgian Bay? This study used satellite imagery and some algorithms to detect the types of plants that were in the area. And what we found in blue here, that as water levels went from the extreme highs down to extreme lows, in the north part of the Georgian Bay, you can see kind of the blue areas. That actually was a gain in wetlands as water levels dropped from the high levels down to the low levels. But in the southern portions of Georgian Bay, you can see predominantly red, and that's where we lost wetland coverage. Next slide, please. So up in the north section, kind of a line between the Tobermory Peninsula and Parry Sound, north of that, we had a 7% gain in wetlands as water levels dropped. But in the southern portion of the bay, which of course is also where all of the development pressures are, we had about a 10.8% loss for a net loss in Georgian Bay of about 3.8%. Next slide. Now, if we, instead of kind of looking at climate change, if we look at what are the impacts that are currently existing on fish, for example, next slide. Kind of look at it from the other direction. So take a particular species and talk about it. First of all, we need to have a better sense of what we actually used to have as far as biodiversity and species in the Great Lakes. And really, we need more to rely on our First Nations and their traditional ecological knowledge. Because there are descriptions of healthy ecosystems where the water level would rise as the lake trout chased the herring into the bays, and the lake sturgeon ate cranberries from the bushes along the shore. We certainly don't see that kind of productivity that you can see in this picture here, a boatload of fish, today. We have a highly degraded ecosystem. About 1% of the biomass that we think used to be in the bay is currently what we are working with. And so when we go to meetings and talk about the state of the bay and talk about it as being fair or unchanging or things like that, we really have a degraded ecosystem that we're considering, and we need more traditional First Nations knowledge. Next slide. Things that are already stressing our fish populations are overfishing, development and habitat loss, and adding climate change to these other stressors just is, kind of the last nail in the coffin in many ways for some of our species. And certainly invasive species and their introduction into our ecosystem over the last half a century have had devastating impacts. We all know the sea lamprey came in when the seaway was opened up and really wiped out almost the lake trout populations in Georgian Bay. Next slide. So climate change is an exacerbating stressor on top of this, because there are things that climate change does that have impacts. For example, the declining ice cover that Aisha talked about will expose areas where the eggs are laid by whitefish and lake trout along the shore to increasing winter storm and wave action. And that actually decreases the egg motility, the survivability of the eggs. So having less ice cover means that the cycles that the fish are used to and the protective ice there that protects their eggs in the winter is gone and can have direct impacts on our fish populations. Next slide. And we already see the Saugeen Ojibwe First Nation confronting the effects of climate change on their whitefish fishery for that kind of a reason. Other impacts are on the stormy, windy days, it gets more dangerous for the First Nations fishers to be out on the water. Next slide. Unfortunately, we have some sad news in Georgian Bay this past week. We had hundreds of dead birds wash up along the shores of Wasaga Beach, Midland, Collingwood, and Tiny Township, likely due to the invasive species, the quagga mussels, and their changing the ecosystem and also increasing blooms of filamentous algae called Cladophora, which then tends to increase the amount of botulinum toxins that are in the water. And round goby, which are an invasive species, can eat the quagga mussels and tend to kind of concentrate the botulinum toxins, and they don't seem too affected themselves. But when are migrating, even some Arctic birds that have migrated through the basin are eating the fish and dying. And one of our staff members found a live bird and tried to take it down to the Shades of Hope Wildlife Refuge, but by the time she arrived, the bird had died. Next slide. So really some direct impacts of changing ecosystems beyond just climate change that are significant, but that are exacerbated by climate change. And next slide. So climate change is adding stress and helping invasive species take hold. For example, Phragmites, when we had our 2013 ultra low water levels, a lot of those exposed lake beds ended up being perfect habitat for new populations of this invasive reed. Next slide. Of course, this reed can grow to about 18 feet tall. And in our wetlands, if you're a turtle trying to make your way through a stand of 18-foot tall Phragmites, often they don't make it. In fact, we find dead turtles, and it certainly disrupts their ability to use the wetland. Next slide. These are occurring everywhere. Georgian Bay Forever has been out since 2012 trying to map and eliminate these stands of Phragmites, but this is kind of the southern portion of Georgian Bay in the Severn Sound area. And you can see there's lots of Phragmites that was established in that time period because of climate change impacts. Next slide. And also increasing storm intensities are putting more water on the ground quicker, which overwhelms even our existing wetlands capability of absorbing it all. And often this just ends up flooding out into the lake, either through our stormwater sewer systems, which go directly into the bay, or from runoff. And that, of course, carries lots of other pollutants and nutrients into the water. And as Aisha mentioned, that helps to increase the blooms of nuisance or even harmful bacteria like blue-green algae. Next slide. Increasing storm intensities are also overwhelming our septic and stormwater systems. In some cases, they're combined still. in the area where the stormwater pipe and the sewage pipe are kind of one and the same. And as they're separated by a little septum that goes down the middle of the pipe, but when water levels are too high on the stormwater side, they overflow the septum and mix with the raw sewage, and we end up pumping raw sewage directly out into Georgian Bay. So in fact, next slide, in the week of September 20th this year, we had 14.5 hours of completely untreated raw sewage bypassing the Collingwood wastewater treatment plant and going directly into the bay, and another 21 hours of a partial bypass where some of the waste had been a little bit treated, but not fully, ending up out in the bay. And that was, that time period, 14.5 hours of bypassing the plant resulted from 1 hour of rain that dropped about 1 inch in the area. So this is a very significant, factor when it comes to nutrients and nutrient loading in our bays. Next slide. We've tried to start installing some technologies that will actually trap some of the waste and litter elements, like these litter traps that are underneath the storm sewer grates. Next slide. And some other kind of similar technology, the gutter bins, which go on the street, edge of the street, trash traps, which go on the end of the stormwater pipes that go into our bay, because they're directly linked to our stormwater sewers. And then other devices like sea bins to try to filter pollution out of the water, particles or pieces of plastic or cigarette butts or things like that that make their way into the bay. So different diversion tactics are trying to be employed to prevent pollution from entering the water because of climate change. Next slide. And of course, falling back on our best resource, our young people. Here's some of our trash team members that are out along their shorelines picking up garbage and waste from the wetlands and making sure the wetlands are clean, and that the animals that frequent the wetlands aren't eating little bits of plastic and things like that that wash up on shore. So some great activity there by our young people. Next slide. We've talked a lot, including Pierre's mention of the fact that Environment and Climate Change Canada is coming out with a study early next year. It began as a paper that Linda Morsch did for Environment and Climate Change Canada called Assessing and Enhancing Coastal Wetland Resilience to Climate Change. We participated in that process, and also next, just advance a little bit, thank you. The draft report will be is currently out and being reviewed, but it'll be finalized and released early in 2022, entitled Adapting to Climate Change, Solutions to Enhance Great Lakes Coastal Wetland Resilience. Next slide. As part of that study, Georgian Bay Forever was asked to help by going out and doing some detailed bathymetry mapping of 4 wetlands sites throughout Georgian Bay. This is kind of adjacent to Beausoleil Island, Treasure Bay there. But we went into the bay and did some very extensive detailed mapping, and actually that gets fed into the digital elevation models that can produce imagery like what I showed you at the Santa Monica Pier. And the next slide. So we need investments, as Mark was pointing out, to address global warming impacts on infrastructure to protect our ecosystems that aren't sufficient. The investments currently aren't sufficient in Georgian Bay at this point. We did participate last fall with a formal session at Environment and Climate Change Canada to raise the priority needs for funding to protect coastal wetlands. And we do rely on our coastal wetlands to keep our water clean. In the face of these increasing sewage discharges, the natural services that our wetlands provide to us will be increasingly important to purify and clean the water up. And next slide. So just some thank yous for the funding that we've received for the work over the years, and some of the funding organizations, including all of our individual Georgian Bay Forever donors. And thank you.
Thank you, David. That was great. We have a few questions which we have time to deal with. So I'm just going to go through those. The first one is for David or Aisha. We've experienced cloudy green algae and perhaps smells this summer. Why? What is the cause? Is it related to water levels? What does the future hold? I think, David, you thought that was Cladophora, but
yeah, Aisha, I'd be happy to let you answer that if you'd like.
Sure, yeah. So the cloudy algae that often forms like around aquatic plants, for example, is a type of green algae, so not harmful, and it's tricky to really pinpoint causes on a case-by-case basis without kind of taking a look at the surrounding area, because often we can see those types of algae clouds in perfectly pristine lakes that don't have any development whatsoever. So it is a natural part of the ecosystem, but definitely if we're seeing increasing trends there, there can be relationships with, like I mentioned, the temperature, wind conditions, and also additional nutrient inputs that might be coming from, storm flushing and that kind of thing, or nearby septic systems, that kind of thing. So important to kind of make sure your surrounding shoreline is well taken care of with buffers and keeping your septic system maintained and all that good stuff. But it is something that we're starting to see more. Hard to say if people are just noticing more or if it's actually on the rise, but definitely we're getting more observations of that type of algae growth.
So the next question was actually answered. So the next one I've got is, how can local freshwater ecologists get involved and support local efforts? And really the answer is to, yes, please do, and volunteer with a local group. Next one is, can we expect to see the intense rainstorms continue or get worse?
I think the answer to that is, yes. And the more energy we put up into the atmosphere, or the more energy the atmosphere traps, the more heat can go into the water, and the more, when the water evaporates, that heat can get transferred back up into the atmosphere, and the whole thermodynamic cycle is just increasingly intense. So yes.
Okay, so the next question is, what does bathing and hair washing in lake contribute negatively to water pollution? Is anything known about potential impacts of sunscreen or on aquatic fauna? Most sunscreens can be highly toxic to coral reefs, so I'm wondering if they are also toxic to other organisms. Aisha, is that something you could take on?
Sure. Now, I would say that, sort of on a wider scale, when you look at how much compounds like that are going to be diluted, that it would be hard to pick up any direct effects. And so any studies that have likely been done on toxicity impacts would probably be in a lab situation where they're looking at, really specific concentrations that might not actually occur out in nature. And so that's not something that we've directly measured or kind of learned too much about. But yeah, if you think about the cumulative impact of a lot of people on a beach, that those concentrations kind of in that particular area could get a bit higher. And so, yeah, it is something to think about when we're, congregating kind of in dense areas, and yeah, hand washing, shampoo, all that kind of stuff, the little drops in the bucket, right? So whatever we can do to mitigate those, using those types of things is good.
So thank you, Aisha. Are there alternatives to willow bushes that provide good stabilization but grow to lower heights? Environment where views are desired and trimming done?
Some of those questions we will, more specifically get to in webinar 2.
That's probably a webinar 2 question. You're absolutely right.
Yep. Next
one is for David. Is there a similar environmental organization monitoring Georgian Bay from Midland to Owen Sound, Tobermory? If not, how can we establish one?
Similar to the Severn Sound Environmental Association?
I think so, yes.
Yeah, so no, not, other than the work that Georgian Bay Forever is trying to do, and the interest that we keep trying to generate to have researchers come up into our bay and do that kind of work, but there is no kind of formal structure that would be equivalent to, Severn Sound Environmental up to Tobermory.
I would kind of interject there just as far as the conservation authorities. So while they're not doing work generally right out in the bay itself. The watershed-based work that they do is quite similar to what we do as well, and they kind of take on a lot of that role.
Yeah, each in their region. So.
Yeah, thanks for that, Julie. It's a good point. Next one is for you, David. Phragmites are invasive, hard to remove, and undesirable, but are they helping control erosion?
Actually, not really. What we've seen, and Parks Canada experienced this last year, with the high water, the actual mats of Phragmites were eroded out of the coastal area and washed right up into the actual forest as the coastal forest was flooded. And so now they have stands of Phragmites that are kind of growing in the forest that came from this kind of coastal stand. And if anyone's seen the southeast side of Beausoleil Island, it's just absolutely massively infested by Phragmites right now. So it would be an area where one would expect you would be able to see if there were, these kind of beneficial effects. But the fact that this invasive species also wipes out about 93% of the other species, or native species, makes it a non-desirable technology to apply to coastal erosion. There are certainly better native plants than Phragmites to do that. And we will be talking about those in seminar 2.
Okay, the last question is for me, which is, there is a major transition from urban areas to more rural areas. This will exacerbate the need to be aware of population impact, therefore more infrastructure. So absolutely, we are very much aware of this at GBA. We spend a lot of time and effort looking at planning matters and ensuring that official plans and comprehensive zoning bylaws are not compromised and are respected all the way up the east and north coast of Georgian Bay. I can't really speak to the other areas that much, but certainly you can see more impacts of urbanization in the Collingwood and Midland areas, for instance. We don't want that to happen where the island communities are on the east and north coast, and it is a battle, and there's a lot of development pressure, particularly in the township of Georgian Bay, which we deal with on a continuous basis. So I'm afraid that's all we have time for questions. So we'll move on to a quick wrap up. David, do you want me to go first, or do you want to start?
You go ahead, Rupert.
Okay, so in this webinar series, we are focusing on the actual impacts of extreme highs and lows and adaptation strategies. In the symposium last year, we determined that the tools that government has at their disposal are inadequate to address these extremes. Understanding the impacts and being informed of strategies to deal with them are very important and something that is within our control, but it will not be enough. So GBF and GBA will continue to explore the larger picture of what could be done to add to the tools available to government to mitigate extreme water levels. This can only be done by all stakeholders working together. David.
Yeah, and that's perfect because, in answering the question, I was thinking about whether there's one organization all the way through. There are a number of partner organizations that we work with, Nottawasaga Valley Conservation Authority, the Blue Mountain Watershed Trust in the Collingwood area, and so on. So all of our organizations working together are going to be needed. And as Mark showed, the importance of pulling kind of collaborations together is, critical to succeeding. What we hope we did today was start to lay the real foundation for people to get an understanding that there are changes that are coming, that these changes are outside of the normal bounds of what we've experienced historically, that the Bay is not the same as your grandfather's Bay, and that the next 2 webinars will start to address specific things around, shorelines and shoreline structures on November 13, and impacts of high water on those and mitigation ideas, as well as in our December 4th webinar, talking about septic systems, potential for inundation, wave action, insurance businesses, the impacts of these expected changes, which are occurring right now. And we'll talk and delve into those topics more specifically.
Thanks, David. Just a reminder that all questions that we have not answered today will be answered either in deliverables following the webinars, or in fact, there are a number of questions received on registration and today that are actually pertinent to webinars 2 and 3, and they will get priority in terms of being answered at those webinars. So Marilyn knows very well how much we should work together. So I think we can now close up the session with a closing prayer from Marilyn. Thank you.
Bonjour. I would like to talk a little bit about our ancestors. Because as the water gets ready to rust, it is the ancestors of whom they will go to sit with. And I listened many years of the same circle of friends and colleagues on the call. We are talking in a different pattern than when we began many years ago. And I'd like to talk about one of my past teachers, Schema Ba, Angus Pontiac. He always gave thanks for the cars. He said in his grandfather's time and his grandfather's father's time, the gatherings would have been much different and perhaps had a longer stay with one another. He talked about being a small boy and being taken, got to the age where he was taken along with the men of the community, and they paddled across the shores. They pushed to where the gatherings were, and they stayed for a long time. Today, we don't have to do those kinds of travels and hardship, but I encourage you to keep maintaining your place and visiting with one another. And at this time, I would like to say Chimagwich to our men, for it is you that allow us in your space. In our culture, the women take care of the water. And also saying that our men take care of birthing the sacred fire that keeps the spirits alive, keep them fed. We believe that you sit in the sky world with your fire bundles and look down over all things that must be looked after. And in that sky world are all of the informations, the governance from the original times. They are written there in the star constellations. We as Nishnawbek people always refer to the 7 grandfather, grandmother celebrations and their teachings. Those too are written in that sky world, and they sit above us. They've always been there, and if we take care of that sky world and honor and respect the men's fire bundles, they will always be there. We talk about the transference of knowledge, and those grandmothers and grandfathers have so much kindness and love for the forever that they also carry that bundle of the forever. I am talking about the Big Dipper. And if you count the stars in the Dipper, there are 7, representing the value of those 7 teachings. And on her knee, as we always love to pass the babies, honor the babies, talk to them, sing to them, make them laugh, comfort them when they cry, and try to feed them nourishment when they are hungry, rock them to sleep. That is why the Little Dipper sits there at grandmother's knee in that sky world. The balance of what the men are being asked to do with the fire bundles is keep that continuity going. The women are the life givers, and we protect those measures, beginning with all things that we share and birth in that sacred water bundle. I look forward to the next gathering. in a moon's time away, because at that point there will be a new teaching about the celebration of water woman getting ready to cleanse, to rebirth, the responsibility. So with that, I would also like to acknowledge in our lifetime, Nokomis Josephine Mondamenba, the message and her legacy and how hard she worked for us to think about her today. We have no word in our language for goodbye. We didn't know what that was. So to the water lily that took her children back to Earth Woman to have a rest and her knowledge, we say Chimigwich. And for each of us, until our next journey comes, Wamampi simply means until the next time. Naho Guamin.
Marilyn, thank you so much. That was lovely. Just to remind everybody that there will be an exit poll sent to you. So please have a look in your email for that and please fill it out and send it back. And please register for the next 2 webinars, a lot more interesting content to come. Thank you so much, everybody who joined this webinar this morning. Thank you once again to our splendid panelists, particularly Pierre and Jane coming from the IJC, which is terrific. Thank you so much. Goodbye, everyone.